Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez, he, him, and I'm the program coordinator for the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. We want to welcome you all today to our webinar titled Assisting Students in Recovery to Overcome Barriers, Lessons from a Campus Without a Collegiate Recovery Program, featuring our very own Dr. Mike Broman. Before we get started, I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to review with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do welcome your questions at any time throughout the live session for our presenter, but we do ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. We do have the chat enabled, so please feel free to introduce yourself and where you're joining us from or any reflections on the shared content. But again, if you have specific questions for our presenter, we do ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. We also encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our recently revamped website at hecaod.osu.edu. We also have a few upcoming events I'd like to share with everybody. We have the fourth session in our Grant Writing Learning Collaborative happening on November 1st and is titled Budgets and Timelines, the Keys to Successful Grant Proposals, and is featuring Cindy Clowner and Jen Morrow. We also have a November water cooler chat taking place on November 14th, and it will be focusing the conversation around medical cannabis and its impact on campus, and it's facilitated by Dr. Jason Kilmer. We also have the 2023 Cannabis Symposium taking place December 7th, and registration is now open and the full agenda is on our website, so you can learn more by visiting our website. Additionally, we have announced the 2024 national meeting taking place at the end of July and the beginning of August here in Columbus, Ohio. But for those that can't join us in person, we will have a simultaneous virtual component. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our presenter today. Joining me today is Dr. Mike Broman, Assistant Professor in the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University. It's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time, Mike.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction, Anthony, and very excited to be here with you all today presenting my research. As Anthony mentioned, I'll be talking about how we might be able to assist students in recovery who do not have access to a collegiate recovery program to overcome barriers to recovery. So let me start out by giving you an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So first, I'm going to talk some about the background just regarding substance use and recovery on college campuses. I know that I was informed that our audience has sort of a whole array of people in different doing different kinds of work. So I'll try to give at least a little bit of background for people who may be a little less aware of kind of the recovery movement on college campuses right now. And then I'll use that to segue into why I studied barriers to recovery among college students specifically. I'll give you a little bit of information about my study methods. And then I plan to spend the bulk of the time actually talking about the study results, which will cover barriers that students experienced and how they overcame those barriers to recovery. And then I'll also talk about implications both for practice and for future research. So in terms of some of the background information, this data is from the most recent edition of the American College Health Association's survey, which includes tens of thousands of students on campuses across America. And so as you can see, substance use is prevalent on college campuses. So within the past couple of weeks, as of the last survey, nearly half of respondents had drank alcohol, nearly a quarter had engaged in binge drinking, and then nearly 20% had also used marijuana in the past 2 weeks. And then in the past 3 months, nearly 20% had engaged in what's considered to be moderate to high risk marijuana use, which could include anything from using marijuana at least on a weekly basis to experiencing some problem in some aspect of life from marijuana use. There are also other substances being used by college students. They're less common, but there are some who report, for example, use of prescription stimulants, prescription opioids, or cocaine. And so, not surprisingly, there are several consequences of substance misuse among college students. So there's links between substance misuse and poor outcomes in the domains of health, relationships, legal issues, as well as financial problems. To drill down on that a little more specifically, this is from last year's ACHA survey, about 1 out of every 8 students who had drank alcohol in the past 3 months reported they had at least one related health, social, legal, or financial problem. And about the same for marijuana, where about 1 out of 8 students who had used it in the past 3 months reported similar problems. I also think it's really notable that about 5% of undergraduate students report that at some point in their lives, they've tried and been unable to control, cut down, or stop using alcohol or marijuana. And when you put 5% of undergraduate students into a real number, that's nearly 1 million students. So substance misuse is an issue affecting lots and lots of college students. There also are poor academic outcomes that are associated with both use of more substances and more frequent use of any given substance. So as students use more substances more often, their GPAs tend to become lower, and they also become more likely to drop out of college and to not return. And then there are also effects on the campus in general. So research has found that where there's more substance use on campus, there's more likely to be noise disturbances, more incidents of physical and sexual assault, property damage. So substance misuse on college campuses affects people from the individual level all the way up to the whole community level. Now, there are some students who are in recovery. The estimate most recently said there are about 600,000 students in recovery. And I also think it's important here to talk about how I define recovery in my study and how I'm starting to see it defined more generally. So the definition I went with is reduce substance use disorder symptomology and improve quality of life. So what's really important there is that that doesn't say anything about abstinence. So abstinence is not necessary to recovery from everybody or for everybody. That's something that is being acknowledged more recently in the literature, I would say, whereas in the past, we tended to think of recovery as it must also include abstinence from all substances. So with that, background information about students in recovery and how recovery is defined, there hasn't been much research on college students who are in recovery who don't have access to a collegiate recovery program. For that matter, there hasn't been a lot of research on students who do have access to such a program, but there's even less on the ones that don't. But some of the studies that are out there establishes that these students face a number of different barriers to recovery at college. One is just, as already discussed in the last couple of slides, that prevalence of substance use is really high. And then there's also stigma on campus towards both people who have substance use issues as well as people in recovery. And so researchers have called campus a recovery hostile environment for these reasons. These students also face competing demands of balancing their recovery with their academic work, as well as maybe employment, family responsibilities, and so forth. And they tend to find it difficult to locate resources that can be supportive of them in their recovery. And overall, there's a sense of isolation and lack of community, lack of sense of community for students in recovery without access to a collegiate recovery program. And this is really important too. The Association of Recovery in Higher Education states that it is vital for students in recovery to connect with each other. And so one of the big questions is, how do they do that when there isn't this institutional support of a collegiate recovery program? And now let's talk about why those programs can be so helpful for students in recovery. So they provide a gathering space on campus, so somewhere to go, somewhere to feel safe, as well as, of course, a linkage to other students in recovery, and at least one professional staff member who can provide and/or link students to needed services, such as perhaps counseling for substance use or mental health. These programs might also include recovery-friendly housing on campus, as well as activities for the members, clinical services, and academic support. And they have varying requirements for membership. Sometimes it's that students must be abstinent from all substances for a specific length of time. Sometimes that's not one of the requirements. Sometimes there's a minimum GPA. With that all being said, there's only 150 or so CRPs right now. The number continues to change, and fortunately it's slowly increasing, but still this is less than 10% of the four-year institutions in the United States are host a CRP right now. So that brings us to what are the gaps in our knowledge about students in recovery. So again, a major one is just in general, what are the experiences of students in recovery who don't have access to a collegiate recovery program? And another one is, what about the experiences of students who are in non-abstinence-based recovery? And then a third one is just, how did the pandemic impact the experiences of students in recovery? So there's been some study, of course, about COVID and college students generally, or COVID and people in recovery generally. Recently saw one study about COVID and students who are members of a collegiate recovery program. But that being said, there's really very little research that's been done on how students in recovery experience the pandemic. So I conducted a qualitative study to address these gaps and to gain greater understanding of the experiences of students in recovery, with the goal being to drive improvements in campus programming for these students. So I'll take a few minutes here to tell you about how I designed my study and the study method. So as far as why I did a qualitative study, there were three key reasons. One was just to allow me to deeply explore what is a fairly untapped area of research from the insider perspective, trying to really get the student's point of view on their experiences of barriers to recovery and how they overcame those. And then the second reason was to really try to bring out the emotional depth of the topic. I thought it was really important to really try to dive deep into participant stories as a partly as a means to really show like, hey, okay, like these students would benefit from some kind of support on campus, right? Here are their stories and here's how that support would help them. And then thirdly, qualitative methods, allow us to explore complex social processes, which I feel anything pertaining to, substance use issues and recovery can fall into that category. And just to reiterate, my overall goal is to illuminate participant stories in order to promote changes, positive changes on campus for students in recovery. To be included, so I conducted a study when I was a doctoral student at Wayne State. So the first inclusion criterion was to be a current undergraduate student at Wayne State. Secondly, one needed to be at least 18 years old. And thirdly, they needed to self-identify as in recovery from a substance use issue. So, focusing on undergraduates at one university allowed me to explore how people in a similar environment overcame barriers to recovery. There was no upper age limit because the research has shown that students in recovery are often older than traditional undergraduate age, like the 18 to 23 age range. And then the self-identification is in recovery is in keeping with that definition of recovery, where it's really, does this person consider themselves to be, experiencing reduced symptomology related to their substance use and improved quality of life. So to give you an overview of the sample, there were 17 participants who ranged in age from 18 to 44, and time in recovery was reported anywhere between 1.5 months to 8.5 years, so quite a range there. 15 did pursue abstinence-based recovery, so that means 2 did not. In terms of gender, there was 1 non-binary participant, 11 female, 5 male. Racially, 1 identified as Native American and white, 4 identified as Latinx, and 12 identified as white. And then 11 of the 17 began recovery before enrolling at the university. So in order to recruit participants, I used this flyer and we posted it on the School of Social Work at Wayne State's Facebook page, as well as through the universities. The university has like kind of a social media / announcement platform, so the flyer was posted there as well. And then the university counseling services were really kind of key allies in doing this work, and they were really helpful in terms of sharing study information with potential participants, whether it was during appointments or over email. And so through these methods, 14 participants enrolled in the study. Recruitment started out really great. I was really excited about it, and then it really slowed down. So then my research team and I contacted previous participants, this was after about 4 months, to see if they'd be willing to share information about the study with people in their networks who might be eligible, and 3 more participants enrolled that way. Each participant engaged in one semi-structured interview that was about 45 to 60 minutes long, consisting of open-ended questions, and was given a $20 Amazon gift card as compensation. So I also wanted to share with you, just to give you a sense of what we asked participants, a couple of example questions. So as you can see, one was, what aspects of the campus environment have challenged you in maintaining your recovery? And then another was, what personal strengths or coping strategies have helped you to maintain your recovery? So again, open-ended questions, really just trying to get, as much depth and as much of the participants' experience as they wanted to share with us. And then I'll briefly also tell you about how I analyze the data before we go into results. So I utilized Broman and Clark's approach to reflexive thematic analysis. So essentially what that means is, first, I just read through all the interview transcripts to really become familiar with the data, and then began coding the transcripts to really dive deep into the data and, again, try to get that insight into what was really going on for each participant. After that, I sorted data by codes and then started to make comparisons across the data set to see what themes I could discern, in these stories. And that continued for a little while. Made sure there was enough data to support each theme, before coming to the final study results. And again, the goal was just really assess what themes were showing up in the data in order to really try to bring out participants' stories. So in terms of results, I'll first tell you what barriers participants talked about experiencing, because that was really important to elucidate that in order to then understand how they overcame those barriers. So there are 4 themes when it came to experiencing barriers. One was substance use and mental health challenges. The second was being overwhelmed by responsibilities. The third was a feeling of isolation. And then the fourth was disruptions that were specific to the pandemic. So now let's talk about those, each of those in a little bit more detail. So when it came to substance use and mental health challenges, there was an interesting sort of dichotomy here, I guess you could say, that arose based on whether or not the student was participating in abstinence-based recovery. So among those that were, typically there was the sense that the first couple of years of recovery were particularly hard because they were experiencing cravings, and also going through that grief process about the loss of being able to use substances. And these students typically describe that substance use was ubiquitous in the environment. So one even used, as you can see here, the word substance use is everywhere. And they talk about, maybe seeing other students vaping a lot, or, using Adderall to, deal with, the stress of exams or whatever the case might be, right? Now, for those among those that were not seeking abstinence, one of the challenges that they face is that they got messaging that abstinence was the only way to go. Like, for example, if they engaged in community-based mutual aid support programs, and they didn't find support for non-abstinence methods of recovery. Another important challenge that arose was that substance use and mental health challenges could combine, such that the student might be prescribed medication to manage mental health challenges, but they were concerned that the medication they were prescribed could also compromise their recovery if they were tempted to use more of the medication than prescribed. Now, in terms of being overwhelmed with responsibilities, there was this pervasive theme that these students were dealing with maybe full-time course load, at least at some point in their educational journey. Some needed to also work. Some were parents, so they were taking care of their children. So that's already a lot. Like, we know that today's college students are stressed. They have a lot on their plates, and on top of all those responsibilities, the students, participants in this study, of course, also needed to, try to maintain and manage their recovery, which required time to do, recovery-based activities, or, maybe go to mutual aid meetings, or just even, make phone calls to family and friends who supported them. So you're taking an already full plate and really overloading it at this point. And some participants talk about how that stress and that sense of overload could create temptation to use substances. For example, one said, I think definitely the amount of stress is a huge factor when you have a million things to do and everyone around you, not everyone, but people around you are dealing with it by taking Adderall. It's this, I don't know, quick solution, but it's not healthy. So we see right here this student's dilemma, right? Very stressed out with everything that's going on, feeling like they have a million things to do. And I see other students use Adderall to, probably stay up later, get their studies done, get everything done. And that could work for me, but I also know where, that can be unhealthy for me. So there's this dilemma that's evident there. And this sense of being overwhelmed could also be really challenging early in recovery, where the student might feel that they needed to find new social groups, new people to hang out with, but also didn't necessarily feel they had the time to do so. So the next, type of barrier was feeling isolated, and this could be related, or there were several sub-themes here, and so isolation could relate to, any of these sub-themes. So one was that participants, in some cases, anticipated that if they were to share with others about their recovery, in an effort to get to know other people better, let people get to know them, that they might end up being stigmatized. So they might feel they needed to keep their recovery private. One of the unfortunate effects of that was that that made it harder to build support on campus. And in some cases, participants did indeed hear stigmatizing comments. And so this reinforced this idea of, I need to keep this recovery private. I need to keep this to myself. Participants also talked about, lacking resources for recovery on campus and how this increased a sense of isolation. For example, some asked even during campus orientation if there were resources for students in recovery, and in so many words we're told, no, we don't really have much other than, you can go to the counseling center, but that's it. And again, just another quote to kind of exemplify this, where this one participant talks about, I don't typically disclose I'm in recovery because I don't want the stigma. I think sometimes when we do substance use, because it's showing up in more and more material, students say some really rough stuff and teachers usually intervene and whatever, but it makes me feel very isolated. Like, oh, I'm glad I didn't tell anybody I'm in recovery. Do I even answer? Do I try to educate? Do I just let it go? So I think this quote really brings, these sub-themes to life here, right? This person, has experienced being in class. There's discussions about substance use, and they hear stigmatizing comments, and that, reinforces this idea of like, hey, you know what? I'm glad I didn't tell other people about my recovery. Now, finally, the fourth type of barrier discussed was disruptions that were imposed by the pandemic. So, there were some themes with this one too, which, for some students included temptation to use, from that sense of isolation and loneliness. For those who utilize mutual aid meetings, there's that loss of socializing before or after. So, the meeting before the meeting after the meeting wasn't a thing when the meetings were on Zoom. And as you can see, to exemplify that sub-theme, there's one quote here, the energy exchange isn't there on virtual meetings. So the vibe just didn't feel the same, right? Like, it was harder to converse with people, harder to kind of read people and stuff like that. There just wasn't that energy exchange. And another says the pandemic completely destroyed my recovery network. So, a complete loss of connection with their peers in recovery. Those who utilize counseling, in some cases talked about that it was harder to find virtual counseling, and that if they did, it didn't feel as effective as face-to-face. And then even when things reopened, which on campus at Wayne State was fall 2021, participants expressed that they felt less connected to people than before the pandemic. And that was also the case, for some who attended mutual aid meetings, where they'd go to the meeting, they'd see everybody there face to face, but they felt that people were hesitant to engage as much as they had before the pandemic. So with that in consideration, let's now talk about how students overcame these barriers. So 4 themes here. One was, just finding their pathway to recovery. Secondly was prioritizing recovery. Third was, building self-acceptance and disclosure. And fourth was overcoming challenges specific to the pandemic. And one thing I'll emphasize here too is that support from various people is important through each of these steps. So in terms of finding a pathway to recovery, there were a few different ways that participants might initiate their recovery. So some used, formal services like counseling or substance use treatment. Some just began attending mutual aid groups that they might have heard about, so they started going to AA or NA or similar. Some engaged in social justice work, activism, and that became their pathway to recovery. And then some didn't use any of the above, but what they did is just lean into existing support that they already had from family and friends. Also, I'll point out that many participants used a combination of these supports, so these were not mutually exclusive. So want to just focus a little bit more on mutual aid groups specifically here, because I thought this was important. Finding too is that some participants described that young people's meetings were especially valuable for them. For example, one said, when I did get to college, though, I went to the 1A meeting on campus, and I met quite a few people who introduced me to young people's meetings. I got involved in all of that, and I just became completely immersed in that community. So that's where I made all of those friends, and they became my bigger supports. And so to give you a little more background too, this participant had talked about starting recovery during high school and just feeling really out of place when going to meetings because, they were so much younger than most of the other attendees. And so when they went to campus and, there wasn't one AA meeting there at the time, they went to that, then they got introduced to other young people's meetings. It was like a revelation for them, like, wow, there are other people my age that are, doing this recovery thing. And so, that really helped them, stick with their recovery and make a lot of friends too. On the other hand, and I feel like this is important to highlight as well, not everybody had a positive experience who, tried mutual aid programs or counseling. In terms of mutual aid, so a couple of participants highlighted how they felt like the abstinence only focus was detrimental to them. Some talked about stigma related to medications, whether those were for opioid use disorder or for mental health, made them feel unwelcome in mutual aid groups. And then one specifically talked about feeling like they didn't fit the crowd because of being younger than other attendees. And counseling could be harmful as well. So one said, I've personally never felt comfortable enough to seek counseling for recovery. The therapist there at school, the institution there, was very, very detrimental. It was very bigoted. And as a queer, trans, autistic communist, I found it's very hard to find therapists and find counselors and find people who unfortunately have been gone through academia and gone through that specifically in relation to psychology and actually feel understood. So here we're seeing this person has, experienced bigotry and prejudice, intersectionality and prejudice based on that is evident in this quote as well. And so by the time that this person started their recovery, the idea of even going to counseling because of those experiences earlier in life was just out of the question. And so when we consider this, that, not all students in recovery are going to have positive experience, some are going to have harmful experiences in mutual aid or counseling, it leaves us with the question of, okay, so what else might be helpful to those students? And so this was also a really interesting finding that the person who, said this quote here ended up utilizing social justice work as their pathway to recovery. And that's where they met, a lot of people that supported them in their journey. So beyond finding a pathway to recovery, students also started to implement different strategies to prioritize their recovery. So there were a few sub-themes there, one of which was reducing academic demands in order to have more time to attend to recovery needs. One was implementing coping strategies, which helped to reduce feelings of being overwhelmed. And then another was to, proactively implement different self-care activities, which could include, prayer, meditation, exercise, going to concerts, to try to maintain, a general well-being and balance. And then avoiding substance use was really important as well. And with this one in particular, participants talked about how support was instrumental. So this might consist of parents checking in or calling to see about the participants' evening plans, or going to a party on campus with friends who supported the participants' recovery and could act as a buffer between the participant and party attendees who might encourage the participant to engage in substance use. So to give you here a couple examples of what participants said about how they prioritize their recovery. One said, then when I was getting sober, I didn't have the focus and attention to do what I needed to do. It was just too hard. I realized at that point that my life depended on sobriety. I think I took a semester or two off because it was just too much. So here's an example of reducing course load in order to have more time to recovery. For this person, the understanding that my recovery is life and death. So that needs to become the top priority. And then another person says, I really have to keep track of my medication and give it to somebody else and monitor myself. And I just feel that's a huge difference between a normal student and then me, because I literally, if I didn't have my medicine, I don't think I'd be doing well. So this person, on the one hand, feels that the medication they're prescribed for mental health challenges is essential to doing well. On the other hand, it's also possible for them to end up misusing the medication. So in order to avoid that, they have to hand it off to somebody else. And the key here to point out is that, these participants, these students in recovery, needed to do things that other students might not need to do, in order to ensure their well-being. And so it's really important for us to keep that in mind as well when, we're working with students in recovery. So then self-acceptance and disclosure was another theme related to overcoming barriers to recovery. And this one, in some cases, helped participants to realize that, there were people on campus who didn't stigmatize addiction and recovery, who were supportive of their recovery. This one also tended to take time for participants. So it wasn't usually the case that they felt comfortable talking about their recovery immediately. And to speak to that point, one participant said, and then the other thing too is after being in recovery for a while, I felt more comfortable being myself, making friends with people who weren't in recovery that were just at my job or different places. So, after some period of time, this person feels more comfortable, more accepting of themselves, and then it's possible to expand their network of friendship and of support. And generally speaking, participants who got to this point talked about how when they were able to disclose that, reduce that sense of isolation that they might have felt earlier, and often were able to actually, have very, direct, heart-to-heart conversations about what recovery meant for them. So finally, let's talk about how participants navigated through those challenges of the pandemic. And this was interesting too, something that I didn't expect would come out. But again, this is one reason why I think it's great to use qualitative methods when we're really trying to get into people's stories, because I believe the methodology allowed for this story to come out, in which some participants newer in recovery actually experienced a benefit of the pandemic, in which they weren't always going out to the store, for example, so they weren't necessarily going through the liquor aisle or beer aisle, and that made it easier to refrain from alcohol. As this participant here said, I think the pandemic also made it a lot easier for me to stay sober, because with the initial lockdowns and stuff, my wife and I weren't going out to the grocery store often. I didn't have excuses to run to the store for anything. I guess that helped the initial time of sobriety. On the other hand, those who had been in recovery for a little bit of time, or maybe a few years even before the pandemic started, typically didn't necessarily like the changes. For example, if they were mutual aid group participants and those had to shift online, they were able to adapt for the sake of maintaining their recovery, though. As evident in the quote here, for me to change what's always worked in recovery, so it's great to be flexible, and I'm all about learning and changing and being flexible in the process. But there's a recipe that I have, and I have to be adamant that I don't compromise that just because the environment changes. Okay, maybe I can't go in person, but I still have to do these things, right? So there's still a sense that, okay, even though, a lot of this stuff is all new, we're doing things differently now in the pandemic, I'm still going to do what I need to do to, maintain my recovery. So now I'll give you a summary of the findings before going into, how does this apply to us as, professionals or researchers. So once again, the barriers to recovery included substance use and mental health challenges, being overwhelmed by responsibilities, feeling isolated, and then challenges that were specific to the pandemic. To overcome barriers, participants first found and settled into a pathway of recovery, which might include utilizing counseling, going to mutual aid groups, getting involved in activism, and or just leaning into family and friend support. Participants then found ways to prioritize the recovery, whether that included reducing academic demands, implementing coping strategies to deal with life's difficulties, practicing self-care to proactively try to maintain, health and well-being, as well as ways to, avoid problematic substance use. Participants who had been in recovery a little bit longer typically described that they built, the feeling of self-acceptance, and that made it more comfortable to disclose their recovery to other people. And when they were able to do that, then they often gained more support and just more friendship. And then finally, participants talked about, some of those specific ways that they dealt with the pandemic. So for those who felt like, it was more burdensome to their recovery, they might have started to, utilize Zoom meetings or virtual counseling, or even just have, kind of virtual meetups with family and friends. And so now the all important topic of what schools should offer for students in recovery. And I'll preface this by saying, like, I'd love it if it were just as simple as like, okay, let's make a collegiate recovery program on every campus. But realistically, like we have to consider issues of funding, especially in the current environment with enrollments continuing to decrease, right? So funding is an issue. There oftentimes is just, unfortunately, administrative resistance to acknowledging that substance use is even an issue on a given campus. And if they were to implement a collegiate recovery program, that's a tacit acknowledgement that, hey, this is an issue. We need support for students who have struggled with substance use. And so that can be a barrier to implementing such a program. And then also just finding a space for a program can be a challenge on some campuses. So one thing that could be done is to offer services in a standalone format, and there are a few possibilities there. One is just substance-free activities. So this wasn't in the section of the interview pertaining to barriers, but later on in the interviews, we asked participants about what they'd recommended university administrators to, provide better support for students in recovery. And that was one that came up, is offer some kind of activities that are substance-free, that are safe, that are comfortable. And I would also suggest too that you might want to consider, on your campus, when and where can the maximum number of students attend these activities? Does it make sense to have a set day and time every week or month, or should day and time be rotated around to try to get more overall attendance? So those are some questions to think about too. Another idea that emerged was to form study groups that would include students in recovery and allies, because when we think back to that theme of being overwhelmed by, trying to balance academics and other responsibilities with recovery, well, if you could meet up with, fellow students in recovery and recovery allies and get some studying done, that helps to, bond with people who are supportive of recovery, while also, ensuring that your schoolwork is getting done. Peer mentoring is another idea. Just in general, having that connection with somebody that has traveled a similar road. I mean, we know that, like in mutual aid recovery, for example, that's a big thing, right? Also in the study, a couple of participants talked about particularly how they felt it was important to give back and, try to network, back with recovery high schools and work with students who are going to be entering college. And so when I thought about that, I thought, what if there was a way to implement a peer mentoring program where students in recovery that you might be able to identify on your campus could be linked up with incoming students who, then they could show those incoming students the ropes and how to navigate college life as a person in recovery. And then another possibility that, I think this would be low overhead, wouldn't really require a lot of funding, is to implement all recovery meetings. And so, again, thinking back to my study data, some students had attended, sort of traditional mutual aid groups like A or NA and had negative experiences. our recovery meetings welcome people in any pathway to recovery, and they actually make it explicit in their opening reading that they're not affiliated with any 12-step group or any other recovery group, and just allow for basically open sharing of where people are at in their recovery. And so this might really be a great way to, make it comfortable for students who don't want to attend, say, their local A or NA meeting, but do want some kind of group support to find such support. Then taking into mind the fact that some students got involved in activism, particularly the one that was really involved in social justice activism, I wondered too about identifying community service opportunities on your campus or city that you're located in, and connecting interested students with those opportunities, giving them a chance to be of service and get involved in causes that might matter to them. And for some students, I think that'd be really a helpful way to connect with like-minded people and other people that might be recovery supportive. And then finally, I think it's important to offer counseling for substance use issues, and that could be in person or virtual depending on the student needs. And another idea, if this is something that you have the time and maybe a little bit of, maybe are able to access a little bit of funding to do, is conduct a needs assessment, right? Because then you can really drill down on, okay, what specifically is needed on my campus. Maybe some of these things on this previous slide you're already doing on your campus. Maybe there's something else that students in recovery might need and want. So we're actually currently doing a needs assessment at Wayne State, which now has a collegiate recovery program in development. We were able to secure funding for that this past year and a half, which is really exciting. But again, you may or may not be able to start a CRP on a given campus. So conducting a needs assessment, I think, could at least help to demonstrate that there is some need for recovery programming. And you might ask about various things. So for example, we're asking about students' substance use history, mental health history, experiences with various recovery pathways, what activities or services would they prefer to see, and to what extent would they like recovery allies to be included in those activities. So again, I think that if you're able to do a needs assessment, that could be a good way even just to start a conversation with university administration about, hey, we have these students in recovery, here's what they need, here's what they're telling us they want, and hopefully go from there and get some kind of programming in place. And now on the research side of things, also some directions for future research that arose out of my study. And one thing that I think it's really important to do, that I'd like to do, is to really drill down further on the experiences of racially diverse students in recovery without access to a collegiate recovery program. I would guess that if we, for example, did recruitment at an HBCU or an HSI, students might have had different experiences than students attending a PWI, right? And really, I think that we can also expand on this point. It could be racially diverse, gender diverse, looking at experiences specifically of sexual minority students in recovery. But generally speaking, I think that the more that we can drill down on, I guess for lack of a better way to put it, subgroups, the more that we can tailor service offerings. And another thing that I plan to continue to look at, and I think is important for us to find out more about, is just how do students recover on different types of campuses. So Wayne State's an urban commuter campus, and what does that mean? Well, one of the things that it means is that, of course, it's in a large city. The campus is kind of spread out throughout the city as opposed to being in one centralized area, and most of the students don't live on campus. So let's think about maybe a residential campus in a suburban area. There might be more students living closer together, which on the one hand could create more opportunities for bonding and support, could also create more challenges related to encountering substance use. So I think that more research looking specifically at different types of campuses and the recovery experiences on those campuses would help us to further target and refine service offerings. And also another question is, how do experiences differ by when students began recovery? Is it perhaps the case that students who started recovery before college, while certainly still experiencing some barriers, are generally in a better place in terms of having built support and maybe students who are starting recovery, when they're already in college, might need even more support to get them through those initial stages and to help them, feel comfortable in their recovery. And my overall goal, in doing any of this research, once again, because it's really important to me that the research informs practice and makes a real world impact, right? So my overall goal is just continuing to conduct research that will be used to improve the experiences for students in recovery. And that's all I have, but I'd love it if people, want to reach out, just chat, if there's any, way I can help. So here's my email address here, broman.6@osu.edu. And with that brings us to the end of my presentation, and I'm really happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Broman. And of course, we'll post these slides so you'll have access to Dr. Broman's email to email them with any questions that you might have at a later date. But we have had a couple of questions come in, so we can go ahead and dive into those. And so our first question is, a hub and satellite CRP model has a larger school with an established CRP open their services to smaller schools in the area, including virtual meetings and programming. Given your findings, how do you think using a model like this might be helpful for students on campuses without a CRP?
I'm sorry, I apologize, Anthony. There was something going on with my audio, so I didn't catch
No worries. I can.
some of that. So if you don't mind repeating the question.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? We're good to go.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So again, a hub and satellite CRP model has a larger school with an established CRP open their services to a smaller school in the area, including virtual meetings and programming. Given your findings, how do you think using a model like this might be helpful for students on campuses without a CRP?
I think I think that has a lot of promise, and I'm excited to hear that that's being implemented. Because when I think about my findings, I think one of the big takeaways I have from that is that it would allow students on the campus without the CRP to connect with students in recovery, right? And hopefully cut through that feeling of isolation and being alone on campus. Um, the one thing that I would say, and I wonder how this is being done currently in those programs, is there some kind of transportation being provided for students between campus A and campus B? Because I'm kind of thinking in the context of, say, Ohio State, like let's say we were to do such a model with another local college. Ohio State's got such a big campus that I think if we're able to provide transportation for other students into our campus, that would also be really conducive to accessing the services. But I love the idea, and I think, when I think about my findings, I think that it has a lot of promise.
Thank you, Dr. Broman. Someone was interested in knowing if you're able to share the needs assessment tool that you and Wayne State used.
Yeah, I think we could do that. I don't see why not. Let me just check with my team, but I think that we could do that.
Great. And then our final question that we've received is, what type of recovery programs can be implemented for online students?
That's a really great question too. Let me think about that one for a little bit. So I'm thinking back on the data. As I think about it now, I'm thinking back on the data, and I didn't touch on this in the presentation, but just thinking about the pandemic shutdown specifically. I'm remembering one participant talked about that they really appreciated just being able to get involved in virtual study groups. And so I guess that's not necessarily recovery programming per se, but now if we tie that in with the idea of having a study group for students in recovery and their allies, that might be something that you can do virtually. And then I also wonder, and again, this would be, well, what about a virtual all recovery meeting? I was going in the direction of a virtual 12-step meeting, but then I'm thinking, well, not every student's going to benefit from that. So what about virtual all recovery meetings?
Excellent. Well, those are all the questions that we received. A big thank you again to you, Dr. Broman, for sharing of yourself and of your work. We're very grateful for the content that you've gave us to, continue to process. I am going to just share a couple of housekeeping slides before we conclude. Again, we just have a couple of upcoming events that I would like to remind folks of. We have the fourth session in our Grant Learning Collaborative taking place on November 1st. We have a cannabis-focused water cooler chat taking place on November 14th and is moderated by Dr. Jason Kilmer. We have now opened up registration and the agenda for the 2023 Cannabis Symposium, and that will be taking place December 7th. And of course, mark your calendars for the 2024 national meeting taking place here in Columbus at the end of July and beginning of August. Additionally, we would love to connect with you, and today's session has been recorded, so you can expect to see today's session along with the session slides uploaded to our website within 3 business days. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you at one of our upcoming events. Take care all.